The river had swollen beyond its banks, fed by days of relentless rain that turned the desert crossing into a roaring, merciless current. Clay Dawson pulled his horse to a halt, the animal snorting nervously as water slammed against half-buried rocks. Clay had crossed this stretch 100 times before, but tonight it sounded alive, angry, hungry. He was about to turn back when something dark flashed between the waves. At first he thought it was driftwood, but then a pale hand broke the surface, fingers clawing at nothing before disappearing again. Clay didn't think. He swung down from the saddle and ran, boots sliding in the mud as he plunged into the freezing water. The current hit him like a hammer, nearly sweeping him off his feet. But he forced himself forward, eyes locked on the spot where the body had vanished. When he reached her, she was already limp, hair tangled around her face as the river dragged her under. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders and fought his way back to shore, lungs burning, muscles screaming in protest. By the time he collapsed onto the bank, rain soaking them both, she wasn't moving. Her skin was cold, too cold. Clay pressed his ear to her chest and felt nothing. No breath, no heartbeat strong enough to notice. He swore under his breath, hands trembling as he rolled her onto her back. Years ago, during a brief and bloody stint riding escort for the army, a medic had drilled the motions into him. Clay never thought he'd need them again. He tilted her head back, pinched her nose, and breathed into her mouth. Her lips were icy, unresponsive. He pressed on her chest, counting under his breath, then breathed again. The river roared behind him as if mocking the effort. Once, twice, 3 times. Just as panic clawed up his throat, her body jerked. She coughed violently, water spilling from her mouth as her chest heaved. Clay nearly laughed with relief, bracing her as she struggled for air. Slowly, painfully, her breathing steadied. Rain streaked down her face, washing away mud and revealing sharp features and high cheekbones that marked her as Apache. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and glassy, and fixed on him with startling intensity. For a moment, Clay expected fear or confusion. Instead, he saw something else, recognition and dread. Her lips moved, barely forming a sound over the rain. "Spirit debt," she whispered. Before Clay could ask what she meant, her eyes rolled back and her body went slack in his arms. The river quieted, but a chill settled deep in Clay's chest. The uneasy sense that pulling her from the water had done far more than save a life. Clay carried her the rest of the way to his cabin, riding with one arm locked around her limp body while his horse picked its way through the dark, rain-slicked trail. She weighed less than he expected. Like the river had already claimed part of her and refused to give it back. By the time he reached the cabin, night had fully settled, and the wind cut through the trees with a low, restless moan. He laid her near the fire, stripped off her soaked buckskin, and wrapped her in every blanket he owned. Still the cold clung to her skin. He sat across from her for hours, feeding the fire, watching for the rise and fall of her chest. More than once, he thought she had stopped breathing again, and each time his heart kicked hard against his ribs. Near dawn, the storm finally broke. The river's roar faded into the distance, replaced by an unnatural stillness that pressed against the cabin walls. That was when her eyes opened. She sat up too fast, breath sharp, hand flying to her chest as though expecting a wound. Her gaze snapped around the room, taking in the rifle above the door, the single window, the man watching her. When her eyes met Clay's, her body went rigid. "You should not have done that," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. Clay stood slowly, palms open. "You were dead or close enough. I wasn't about to leave you there." Her jaw tightened. She looked down at her hands, as if they no longer belonged to her, then back at him. "The river took me. You pulled me back." "That's usually how saving someone works," Clay replied, though unease crept into his voice. She rose to her feet, swaying slightly, and crossed the space between them. Before he could step back, she pressed 2 fingers flat against the center of his chest. Heat exploded beneath his skin, sharp and sudden, like he'd been branded. Clay gasped, staggering away, knocking into the table. "What in God's name was that?" he snapped. Her eyes were dark with something close to fear. "A bond," she said quietly. "My people believe when death is cheated, it demands balance. A life returned creates a debt." Clay laughed, but it sounded wrong, hollow. That's superstition. Outside, his horse screamed, a raw, terrified sound that froze Clay's blood. The lantern flickered, shadows stretching and twisting along the walls. Clay reached for his gun without thinking. The woman shook her head. "You feel it already," she said. "Your breath is heavier. Your heart is louder. The spirits know your name now." Clay swallowed, chest still burning where she had touched him. "Then tell me who you are," he said, "and tell me what kind of trouble I just dragged home." She hesitated, then spoke. "My name is Naya, and you were never meant to save me." The trouble didn't wait long to show itself. By the next night, Clay knew something was wrong with him. Sleep came in jagged fragments, torn apart by dreams that felt too real to be dreams at all. He stood knee-deep in the river, watching it run thick and red, carrying faces instead of water. Voices whispered from beneath the surface, speaking words he didn't understand, but somehow knew were meant for him. Each time he woke, his heart hammered as if he'd been running for miles, and his mouth tasted of iron. During the day, his hands betrayed him. He missed easy shots while hunting, bullets striking dirt where deer should have fallen. His horse refused to obey, rolling its eyes and backing away no matter how softly Clay spoke. Even the land felt wrong. The wind shifted without warning, carrying the sound of distant chanting that vanished when he tried to follow it. Clay had spent his life trusting his instincts, and now they led him in circles. Naya watched all of it in silence until the third evening, when the air around the cabin grew heavy and cold. The fire dimmed, though the wood was dry, and the shadows along the walls began to move against the light. Clay reached for his rifle as a pressure built in his ears, like the moment before a storm breaks. "They are here," Naya said, her voice low. From the corners of the room, darkness thickened, stretching into shapes that were almost human, but never fully solid. Faces formed and dissolved, mouths opening in soundless cries. Clay fired, the rifle's crack echoing through the cabin. But the bullets passed through the shapes, as if through smoke. The shadows pressed closer, and his chest burned again. The same place Naya had touched. She stepped between him and the darkness, lifting her hands. Words spilled from her mouth in Apache, sharp and commanding. The shadows recoiled, shuddered, then slid back into the corners of the room, vanishing as suddenly as they had come. The fire flared, and the weight in the air lifted. Clay leaned against the table, breathing hard. "You said superstition," he muttered. "This doesn't feel like superstition." Naya turned to him, her face pale. "I was chosen to die," she said. "The river was meant to carry my spirit away. It was a judgment, and I accepted it." "Accepted dying?" Clay asked. "For defying a vision," she replied. "For trying to change what was foretold. By saving me, you bound yourself to my fate. The spirits will not forget that." Clay rubbed his face, exhaustion sinking into his bones. "Then tell me how to end it." Naya looked toward the distant sound of water. "Debts are paid where they are born," she said softly. "And the river always collects." They reached the river at first light. The sky washed pale and colorless, as if even the sun hesitated to rise. The water no longer raged, but its calm felt deliberate, waiting rather than resting. Clay dismounted without a word and stood at the bank, listening to the soft rush of the current. Every step he took toward it made his chest tighten, the unseen bond pulling like a rope around his ribs. Naya turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "If I return myself to the river, the debt ends," she said. "But it will take you too. You crossed into what was not yours." Clay nodded slowly. He had known the truth long before she spoke it. Since the night of the shadows, he had felt himself thinning, as if parts of him no longer fully belonged to the world. "And if I go alone?" he asked. She swallowed. "Then the balance is restored. I live. You do not simply die, you become part of what watches." Clay let out a quiet breath and removed his gun belt, setting it on a rock. He thought of all the men he'd buried, all the times he'd ridden away from things he couldn't fix. This, at least, was something he had chosen. "I pulled you out because it was right," he said. "If the river wants payment, it can have it from me." Naya grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "You saved me," she said, her voice breaking. "Your spirit should not pay for my defiance." Clay gently freed himself from her grip. "Maybe it's not about punishment," he replied. "Maybe it's about making sure the scales don't tip too far." He stepped into the water, It was colder than he remembered, closing around his boots. Then his knees, his waist. The current tugged at him, not violently, but with steady insistence. Naya cried out behind him, her voice swallowed by the open space of the riverbank. When the water reached his chest, Clay paused. He looked back once, meeting her eyes. There was no fear left in him, only a quiet resolve. Then he took another step and the river rose to meet him, folding over his shoulders, his head, his breath. The water stilled. Naya fell to her knees, the bond in her chest snapping like a severed cord. The river flowed on, ordinary once more. Far downstream, a battered cowboy hat surfaced briefly, spun in a slow circle, and disappeared beneath the current. And in the years that followed, travelers spoke of a lone rider seen near that crossing at dusk, standing watch over the water, making certain it never took more than it was owed.